Well, my friends, welcome to Breakfast with Sergio Artists in Lockdown series. Today, I'm super excited to have with me all the way from Oklahoma, Sarah Atlee, and we're going to be talking about Patreon as a crowdfunding platform, specifically for the times that we're living right now. Hi, Sarah. Good to see you today. How are you?
I'm doing very well, and thank you so much for having me for your show today.
Well, no, thank you for making space for us, time for us. I know we're kind of all indoor in some way or fashion, so
Right.
it is kind of easy to connect with one another. Thank you for also talking about a platform that has been around for a while, a platform that many artists have heard about. Maybe some of them have been involved with in some way or fashion, or maybe some are like super curious about what is Patreon, how it works, and how it can also help them as artists in their career and engaging with their community and so on. So this is something that you have done for a few years, and in this episode we can unpack a little bit of the Patreon kind of a question out there, right? What is it, what it does, and how it works. So before we talk about that, Sarah, tell me a little bit about yourself as an artist and the type of work that you do.
Okay, well, I'm based in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and I came to my current way of working in sort of a roundabout way. I grew up in a house with a lot of functional art. Both my parents are artistic. My dad was a ceramicist and a weaver, and among other things, and my mom is a graphic designer, and we had a lot of artist friends. So I grew up being accustomed to art, not just hanging on the walls, but also in the kitchen cupboards and on the floor, and just kind of a regular part of everyday life. So art was normal for me while I was growing up. And I was lucky enough to be able to study art in high school.
Okay.
And I got really into painting at that time. And when I started college, I knew that I wanted to focus on painting as my medium. And so I mostly worked with acrylic painting. I did that during my undergraduate and graduate years, and continued as a professional gallery artist for a total of about 20 years.
Wow.
And but something else interesting happened during that time. Like I said, I grew up with a lot of functional art, and that included textiles and quilting.
Okay.
And I sort of got interested in quilting as just kind of a hobby, just something I would do once in a while. I knew how to use a sewing machine and could do a little bit. And about 5-6 years ago, I learned about what is called the modern quilting movement. And I discovered that this is kind of a new world, a community that fits me really well. And I started getting more and more into making quilts, and I discovered that it started to interest me much more than painting.
Wow.
And
What
so
were you doing as a parallel?
yeah, they were kind of parallel. Yeah. And I started having this interesting conversation with myself where I would be working on paintings for a gallery show, and I would get kind of bogged down in the process. And I would say to myself, okay, well, you can't make any more quilts until you finish these paintings.
Yeah.
And I had to go through that with myself a few times before I realized, okay, I need to try following this other path instead and see where that leads me. And I'm very, very glad that I allowed myself that major change in artistic direction because it's led me to some excellent places. And so as a full-time artist now, quilting is my medium.
Very cool. So how long ago was it that you made that transition?
That was around 2014, 2015. My last show of paintings was in the fall of 2016.
Okay, very cool. And this is exciting because, as an artist, sometimes we feel like we have to be married to one medium or to one way, but actually not, right? No, there are no rules that say this is what you must do. It's just kind of, that's how as we get out of art school and we kind of continue the path that we started. But it's really cool to hear from your story, how you totally veer from one medium to another, which doesn't involve paint and wet media, but it's the fabric and
right. So many of the same principles are at play with color and composition, line, shape, all of that good stuff. And I'm just really, really glad that I allowed myself the grace to change directions and to follow what really interested me.
Very cool. And one of the things that I'm super excited to chat with you about is this idea right now, as we experience the pandemic, right? Nobody knew this was coming, this is not something that we all plan. Okay, when that happens, I'm going to do A, B, or C, right? We were all just got into it. And now is a time which a lot of artists are also looking into different ways of continuing their art practice, and also exploring platforms like, crowdfunding platforms, Kickstarter, Patreon, and so many others. I myself as an artist also having my educational practice where I have an online academy as well. But in the terms when it comes to Patreon, it's a platform that's been out for a while. You've been using it, I believe, 3 or 4 years or so. And tell us a little bit about what's the difference between Patreon and also the typical crowdfunding campaign that others might hear of, like, for example, GoFundMe or Kickstarter.
Yes. Okay. Well, the way I explain that to potential patrons is that Patreon is a crowdfunding platform similar to Kickstarter, GoFundMe, things like that, except instead of raising a whole lot of money for one big project, I work on the subscription model where people
Mm-hmm.
pay a little bit of money every month for just whatever I'm working on at the time.
Mm,
So people seem to understand that subscription model pretty well.
yeah.
And I had been really waiting. I'd been looking at things like Kickstarter
Mm-hmm.
before I started my Patreon campaign. And I realized with Patreon, it came along just at the right time for me, because I was looking for a method of crowdfunding that didn't build up to one giant thing, but
Right.
rather allowed me to support continuous creativity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's I think, great way of explaining the difference. While the crowdfunding goes towards like one big like show or projects, more like project based when you're doing GoFundMe or Kickstarter versus the ongoing membership. I always think of it when I talk about it. I always tell artists it's like, think of it Netflix, right? You subscribe to Netflix and you
Yes,
have access to Netflix until you start paying for that right? Uh, so it's kind of easy to understand that membership part of it.
yes,
And
it's a great way to look at it.
yeah, and also tell me a little bit about, because I think a lot of artists or confused or think of, okay, I'm gonna start a Patreon and people just give me money for it, and then I'll just post. So they treat it like if it is going to be another social media, but it's not that. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Patreon platform actually works? What's the purpose? It's not just for people to give you money just because.
Right. The part where people give me money, that's a great part. But I
Yeah,
wanted to be able to offer something unique and special in return,
exactly.
and I'd be able to offer something that only I do, that people were not going to get anywhere else.
Hmm.
And so it was really important for me from the start to make physical art objects and give them or mail them to my patrons. And that's still a cornerstone of my
Hmm.
Patreon practice. One of the
Hmm.
things that I do every single month is I send out handmade collage postcards to at least one of my patronage tiers,
Hmm.
and that they're different every single time, and each one is unique from one another. And it's really a pleasure to get a piece of physical mail in your mailbox that was
Yeah.
sent directly from one person to another person, especially right now. And
Right.
I'm really glad to be able to do that. I also make other kind of more involved art objects,
Hmm.
small quilts that I can ship to people. I make prints. I used to make prints on paper. Now I make prints on fabric and turn those
Okay.
into a fabric construction, things
Very
like
cool.
that. So making art objects and delivering them directly to my patrons
Hmm.
has been a principle of why I'm on Patreon in the first place.
Right. No, I love how you explain it. And the tiers is a big part of Patreon, where you can set up, tiers of different things, different levels of access pretty much to what you're putting it out there. And I know many artists or creators, are using Patreon, for example, also for podcasts, or others are using it for illustration or Photoshop techniques, or there's a big gamut. It seems like the majority of people are using it for like tutorial base. Now, do you
Mhm.
have also a tier for that on your Patreon where
I
you have?
don't, and that's something I
Okay.
looked at from
Hmm.
the before I launched my campaign. I wanted to see what other visual artists were doing on Patreon,
Yeah.
and I noticed that a lot of them were doing things like what you described,
Right.
tutorials,
Hmm.
videos, podcasts. And those are not things that I do as a normal part of my creative practice. There's nothing wrong with those things.
Hmm.
It's just not what I prefer to focus on. And I decided that I didn't have to make my Patreon offerings look like what other artists were
Mm,
offering. And that's okay too.
yeah.
So again, I looked for something that would be unique coming from me that my patrons would not get from other artists
Right.
necessarily.
And is that related to also kind of like your target audience that you want to gear to? Because you know, as you set up your tiers, you kind of have to know what's your target audience. So since it's not a teaching platform, for example, you know, you're setting it up as patrons who follow and love your art and would love to really, um, you know, get one of those pieces in the mail from you, right? And the other benefits, not necessarily that they want to themselves make quilts.
That's right. Yeah. And I started my Patreon campaign understanding that the audience I already had and the
Mm-hmm.
audience I wanted to attract are art collectors.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them are artists themselves, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But teaching other artists is not the basis for my Patreon work.
Excellent. I love that. And that's why, you know, I was really excited that you came here to talk with us, because I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. Artists sometimes think like, well, I have to teach something, right? Or I have to give you know, in order for this to work. Before
This
we
is
close, yeah, before we close, and you can give us also information on where we can find you. Throughout the episode, we have been seeing lots of your work also here in the video. But before we close it up, tell me maybe a couple things that you have learned about Patreon for somebody who's maybe in the fence, like, is this something for me or not? You know, what would a couple kind of words of advice from your experience in Patreon?
Sure. I think the biggest lesson that I've learned in running this, I've been doing this for over 4 years now
Mm,
without a break. And
wow,
over the last 4 years, I've changed little things here and there, the way I do things. And my audience has come right along with me. So that's never been a problem.
that's great.
But I think of it as another part-time job, which it is.
Yeah.
It can be a person's full-time job, but you have to take it that seriously in order to build a following. It takes time and work to build a
Hmm.
following,
Hmm.
and the work you put into it, the time you put into it, is completely worth it.
Right. Absolutely. And what I love about Patreon, you know, as we close, is that, you know, the tiers are very affordable too. So you have, you know, sometimes I've seen a lot of pages like from $1, $2, $5, all the way to maybe 100. You know, so there's, you know, there's different tiers in which people can participate, which makes it really great as well.
Yes, I love being able to offer different pledge tiers, different price points for people who want
Yeah.
to support my art. Hey, if you only got $2 a month and you can contribute that to me, that's awesome.
Yeah.
You're just as important to me as the person who can contribute $50 or $100 a month.
Right.
Every one of my patrons, no matter how much money they're pledging to me every month, they're equally important.
Excellent. Well, sir, I think after this conversation, there'll be a lot of our friends who would love to go and check out and maybe also become patrons of yours as well. So where can they go to find you on Patreon?
Well, I'm pretty easy to find. My Patreon address is patreon.com/Sarah Atlee, SARAHATLEE.
Excellent. And how about in social media? Where can we find you?
I beg your pardon?
How about in social media? Where can we find you?
I am on Facebook. I have both a personal profile and a business profile on Facebook. So if you just search Sarah Atlee, you will find me. And I'm also on Instagram, and it's my name, Sarah Atlee. And surprise, surprise, you can also find me at sarahatlee.com.
Awesome. Well, you've been so great, sir. Aren't you glad that you started this before the pandemic? You know,
I
that you had this
absolutely
system
am.
before.
Yes, I'm really glad that Patreon was already something that's a part of my regular routine, and that I
Yeah.
already had this great core of supporters
Right.
before we found ourselves in this horrible situation. It's been a real blessing.
Excellent. Well, and now you've been a blessing to our audience here. Thank you so much for sharing your information
Thank
and
you.
for sharing your insights. Thank you, my friends, for checking this out. Please do me a big favor, share this episode with your friends. Sarah and I will be so excited if we see our episode shared in your page. So, and if you want to reach out to Sarah, please send her a message as well. Have a great day. Goodbye.